Hello and welcome to this presentation on my diversity field experience. So starting out with this process, it was important to pick a topic that I was very interested in. So recent discussions on immigration policies and a growing anti-immigration sentiment here in recent years had made me want to learn more about new cultures. So it was important that I get something totally different than my experience here growing up in Minnesota. So I decided to interview two people and have conversations about their immigration experiences and their culture as well. So I have the privilege of working with a very diverse group of people. So I found two women that I work with who were born in Ethiopia and Kenya, respectively, and they both agreed to be interviewed. However, I had to change course a little as both of them preferred not to be recorded, so I respected their wishes and changed course. I think ultimately this was beneficial because it made them more comfortable in discussing certain topics without fear of being recorded and allowed the conversation to occur more naturally. Prior to this experience, I knew little about Ethiopia or Kenya. I was raised in northern Minnesota, not a lot of diverse population. I did, however, spend over a decade living in Sacramento, California, a very diverse city, but most of my experiences were with people from Mexico and Central America. And so I thought it was very cool that I got to learn more about two African nations. Although I had to change the interview process slightly, I did keep the questions that I had made beforehand. A lot of them revolved around why they moved to the U.S. or their diet and how it's changed, or any traditions and how they've changed. We briefly touched upon discrimination as well. The first woman that I interviewed is from Ethiopia, and she moved here when she was 17 years old. She was a member of the Oromo people, and back in Ethiopia, they're the largest ethnic group, and they experience a lot of discrimination. So there's been a lot of war over the decades, so a lot of people are forced to move from Ethiopia, and they have settled here in the U.S. In fact, Minnesota has one of the largest populations of Ethiopians outside of Ethiopia, and majority of them are Oromo people. So, conducted a lot of our conversations around lunchtime. So, I think that kind of influenced the direction because we talked a lot about food, and I was very surprised about how much the American cuisine has had a influence on her and her family's culinary decisions. She mentioned that Ethiopian food takes a very long time to prepare, so it's not always convenient. So she prepares things like spaghetti and uses more traditional food as well. But spaghetti is more convenient for her and her family, so she often brought that during lunch. Um, we also talked a little bit about the 4th of July, being that our discussions happened around that time. And she had mentioned that a large group of Oromo people celebrate the 4th every year down in Minneapolis. And I had asked, could I go down there and, experience traditional cuisine? And she jokingly mentioned that they cook hot dogs and hamburgers. So that was pretty neat. Other holidays, her and her family celebrate our Thanksgiving and New Year's as well. We briefly touched upon clothing, and they do have a traditional attire, but that is worn more during important events and when she goes back home. Otherwise, a lot of people have adapted to American attire, t-shirt, jeans, and tennies. She also follows her Islamic faith, so that has a large influence on her attire as well. people from Ethiopia are um, members of a variety of faiths and Islam and Christianity. So that has a large impact on what they wear as well. The other woman I interviewed is from Kenya, and she moved here due to economic reasons. Her family moved here when she was young, and like many other people from that area, war and poverty has forced many to move here. And like the Oromo people, we have a large population of Kenyans, and it's estimated that over 5,000 live here in the Minneapolis area alone. But like the previous discussion, we talked a lot about food, and I learned some neat things about ugali, a traditional food from that part of Africa. It has kind of a mashed potato-like texture, and it's made of cornmeal and served with certain meats and vegetables. She mentioned her first experience with American food, that it's very salty and sweet, a lot of sugar and salt. So when she goes back to Kenya, it takes a while to get used to that food as well. She loves pizza and other American food too. One of the neatest things she told me about was when she moved here, her first experience with snow, and that she loves snow but not the cold. So she could have snow without the cold weather. That would be a lot better. We also talked about kind of a shared history of Kenya and United States, both gaining independence from Great Britain. So one of the major holidays her and other people from Kenya celebrate is their independence, which takes place in December. Some of the common themes I gathered from the discussions and after looking at my notes is that you hear a lot about opinions that from people that maybe have an anti-immigration stance, that people from other countries do not adapt to American culture or they should be forced to. And I didn't see that at all. I see a lot of the reverse, that they both adapted to American culture quite well, and it's had a big impact on their lives, and they've integrated very well. They also mentioned when they go back home that they sometimes feel like strangers, that they've become more American in a way, and it can be very different going back home. Both of them also just sought a better life here in the United States, whether it's war or economic reasons, poverty. They just ultimately sought a better life here in the United States, and Minnesota has welcomed them. They also mentioned they both have children, so their children have become more American than their parents, and they don't share the same interests as their parents or grandparents, due to the fact that they've been raised in the United States. We touched briefly upon discrimination and whether they decided to share their real experiences or not. Neither one of them really mentioned too many bad experiences with that, except for certain instances, being yelled at, for instance. But other than that, they feel pretty welcome here in Minnesota. Overall, reflecting on the experience, I realized that I do have a lot in common with these two women. For example, when I was 20 years old, I sought better economic conditions, and I moved to California to look for employment and schooling. So we kind of share that in common, that essential need for a better life. Future experiences I want to have include visiting maybe Kenya or possibly Ethiopia, but I've always wanted to visit Kenya. But until then, I want to go to a authentic restaurant, and there are a number of them in Minneapolis to try out, and they had mentioned a couple to try. So after school's out, I plan on going down and having that experience as well. Thank you for joining me for this experience, and have a wonderful day.